my dears, welcome to another video. Glad to have you. My name is Sydney, pronouns they, them, and I'm a lot of things. For the sake of this video, I'm a dramaturg and disability scholar with primary focus on accessible theater, and about once a month-ish I make historical deep dives into shows in the theater canon that involve disability. My last project was Sweeney Todd. It was a fun time. It was also very long. I promise you this one will definitely be shorter than 2.5 hours. This is also the first video that I'm filming after reaching 10,000 subscribers, so hi, thank you for being here. I love and appreciate all of you. What else am I forgetting? Video description. Yes, I'm a white person with light brown shoulder length curly hair that's a little messed up because I just had to walk several blocks in the rain. And I am wearing a white button-up shirt because Tommy is famous for wearing a white turtleneck and I don't own turtlenecks because I have sensory issues. So this is the Tommy cosplay that you're getting, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. Okay, that was enough introduction. Let's talk about the Who's Tommy. First thing I need to do is issue a disclaimer because everybody has a lot of opinions on Tommy, whether it's the show or the album or the film, but we're not going to really talk about the film today. And everybody seems very defensive of these opinions because this album holds a lot of emotional weight and nostalgia for a lot of people. And also for other people, the fact that the words blind, deaf, and dumb are used in a very famous intellectual property is enough to make them universally hated. And then when both sides talk to each other, there's just a lot of yelling because everybody is mad. And the comment sections and threads that I had to wade through to make this video are terrifying. There's also a history of disabled people or people in general talking about disability in the show in a critical manner and then getting bullied off of the internet for it. And I can only assume that's a huge reason as to why there's little online discourse about this piece, and it only seems to happen within the in-person disability community, but also the lack of scholarly input for me to agree or disagree with here means that I'm putting myself out on a bit of a limb with this video more than I typically like to do, which as somebody who also works in this industry and wants to be not universally hated for having opinions, is terrifying. And it is also made me feel like my thoughts on this piece, while heavily backed up in what I know as a scholar and the analyses that I have done in regards to many other shows, feel very out there and controversial, and like they're somehow gonna let down both sides of the argument somehow, and more specifically the disability community might come for my head. I don't know, we'll see. I just am saying this because I don't get nervous about making videos anymore. I haven't for a while really, but for some reason I had like 3 or 4 panic attacks while making this one, and that's weird, and I want to be really upfront about that because I think that in of itself is indicative of the cultural problem around the show, and I'm not quite sure what it's indicative of as a cultural problem, but it definitely is something to ponder. But on that note, we are not going to continue that harassment tradition here. I will be heavily moderating the comment section. Please be kind to each other. And my kind, friendly recommendation would be take a deep breath, be willing to look at this piece from either direction with an open mind, and don't put anything in the comment section until you have finished watching the entire thing, because this is going to be very messy and contradictory and nuanced, which is honestly my favorite land to live in. We love nuance is like my key word. Now, in the disability theater community, or at least in my circles of it, we have a tendency to constantly joke about how Tommy is like the cardinal sin of problem shows. And I have been on that bandwagon for years. I listened to the album forever ago and I was like, I hate it, and was really angry about it. But I also have a responsibility, as I said earlier, as a scholar to present something from every single nuanced angle and really try to get into the head of a piece, understand its context, its perception, intention versus impact, all of that stuff. And while I think the disability community might murder me for this, I really like Tommy. I've grown to really, really love it, with some asterisks, and we're gonna get to those asterisks. But I'm just saying this now because there's a perception that the disabled community just hates this show and this album and critiques it without getting it or understanding it. And that perception is used to deliberately ignore what disabled people have to say about this show and or silence us. And so I want to say up front that is not what's going to happen here. I'm going to be semi-defending it, but not really. Also, this is a really great reminder for me personally to not express opinions on things that I don't actually know much about. But yeah, so the plan. We're gonna talk about what the Who's Tommy is, we're gonna go through the plot, we're gonna talk about the history of the show, we're gonna break down the adaptations, talk about the current Broadway revival, which I saw yesterday. By the time you're seeing this, it'll have been Tuesday. Talk about the mechanisms of disability narrative in this piece, and my proposed ways to make it a more ethical production and also effective as an artistic piece. It's gonna be great, it's gonna be messy, I'm excited, hope you are too. Also, I'm sorry, there's a lot of caveats. This happens every single time I make a long video. I normally don't ask you all to like, share, and subscribe because I know that most of my audience are people with pathological demand avoidance, so if I ask you to do it, you're not going to. But to ensure that I both got an accessible seat and was able to see the show shortly after opening and get ahead of the disability discourse around it, I did have to buy a full price ticket to the show, and I don't make a lot in AdSense every month to cover that cost. So please interact with this video however you feel so inclined. It would be really helpful for me and I would really appreciate it. Anyway, Tommy. Now Tommy, or The Who's Tommy, is a rock opera concept album released by The Who in 1969. It completely changed the game in regards to rock and also albums and also music in general. We'll get to that history later, and they did perform it at Woodstock if you're wondering. People tried to stage this starting very soon after the release of this album. It became a movie that involved The Who in 1975, and in 1992 Pete Townsend, the main songwriter for The Who, worked with then artistic director of La Jolla Playhouse, Des McAnuff, to create what became the 1993 Broadway production of The Who's Tommy, with music and lyrics by Pete Townsend and book by Townsend and the director Des McAnuff. It then became absolutely massive regionally. It's a huge fan favorite. You cannot escape it. And there was a 30th anniversary revival at Goodman Theater in Chicago last year, and that production moved to Broadway and opened last Thursday at the Nederlander Theater, which is why we're talking about it now, because if something is open on Broadway in regards to disability stuff, I push that before the rest of my historical deep dives. Now, the plot has changed a bit across the different iterations, primarily with the order of events more than anything, but here is the musical plot, and then we'll talk about the original and other changes afterwards. Also, content warnings for drugs, murder, CSA, bullying/torture, and sort of medical abuse. Rock and roll, baby. Okay, so we open on a young couple falling in love and marrying during the Second World War. We later learn that they are a Mrs. and a Captain Walker. Walker gets shot down and becomes a prisoner of war and therefore doesn't come home, and the officers are like, Mrs. Walker, he's not gonna ever come home. And she's like, okay, and then she has a son and she names him Tommy, and then we flash forward to 4 years later where Mrs. Walker is with her lover in their home, and 4-year-old Tommy is very teeny tiny and very cute, and she sings to Lover and Tommy about how 21 is going to be a good year because she's turning 21, it's her 21st birthday. Now, the original album was in the aftermath of the First World War, not the Second, so it was 1921, which made sense. They moved it to being the Second World War for the film and the musical, and in the film, I believe they sung 1951 is going to be a good year, and it just sounded weird, so they changed it back for the musical and just decided to have it as her 21st birthday, which does mean that she got married when she was 16, but it's fine. Don't worry about that. Anyway, so they're singing and being in love with each other, and the lover is like, let's get married, and she's like, okay, yeah, let's do it. But then suddenly Captain Walker comes through the door and she runs to him because, you know, that's her husband, and then the lover starts to attack him, and then the commotion wakes up a little Tommy and he runs downstairs, and Mrs. Walker turns him around so he can't see them fighting, and then in an act of self-defense, Captain Walker shoots the lover dead. It is in this moment that they realize that Tommy, while turned around, had seen everything happening in the mirror. So they start to tell him that he didn't hear anything, and he didn't see anything, and he isn't going to say anything to anybody because it didn't happen, and you didn't hear anything, you didn't see anything. That's the whole song. The trauma of watching this happen renders Tommy, as we could best describe, catatonic. He only walks when slightly dragged, he looks straight ahead, he's very like angular with his movements, he doesn't make any sounds or facial expressions, and he doesn't respond to any sound or other outside stimulation. At this moment, we see older Tommy appear. He's about 20 or so, and he sings about little Tommy's inner world, how everything he understands of the world is through vibrations. The original idea of this is that he was like Tommy's living in the music because the music is a direct translation of the vibrations that he experiences the world through, if that makes any sense. And the lyrics in the song talk about thoughts as bold as thoughts can be, loving life and becoming wise in simplicity, sickness will surely take the mind where minds can't usually go, come on the amazing journey and learn all you should know. That sounds really weird not sung, and I'm really sorry, but you know, copyright, even if I sing it might flag me. But in this song, he kind of sings down to himself, like Big Tommy to Little Tommy, saying like this child is a rich inner world he's living in that sort of protects and cushions him from the horrors of everything around him, and that Big Tommy is going to be your leader and your guide on the amazing journey that you're about to go on. It should also be noted that he does in this song refer to himself as deaf, dumb, and blind, specifically deaf, dumb, and blind boy. This is the first time that we hear this specific language used in the show. There's discussion to be had as to whether this song is meant to be from older Tommy's perspective or from a sort of omniscient narrator creature that we've had up until this point, but the original staging has it as older Tommy and it's been staged that way ever since, so we're just gonna run with it being Tommy. But either way, they're going on an amazing journey. Tommy's gonna bring you on as your guide. This narratively makes a lot of sense you'll see why later. Then we go to court. Captain Walker's found not guilty for the murder because it was self-defense, and the judge is like, hey Tommy, you should be really happy, and Tommy doesn't respond at all. Then it's 1950, Tommy is 10 years old, they bring him to a gazillion doctors. Why it took them 6 years to decide to get him medical attention beats me, but okay, cool, sure, great, amazing. He gets passed around tons of different doctors, they poke and they prod, whatever, none of them have any answers as to what's going on, and the parents are really upset about it, which, again, it has been 6 years since this started, so how are you just... Anyway, now it's Christmas time, and they're singing about how all the children are excited about their new toys, and Tommy doesn't even know what day it is, and he instead sits on the floor, unresponsive to everything around him, and rocking back and forth. And everybody around him sings, I forgot to mention this is an opera. Did I forget to mention it's an opera? Everything's sung. There are like a handful of lines, but it's majority just singing. Sorry if I forgot to mention that. Okay, so they sing about how they're worried that since Tommy doesn't know what praying is or who Jesus is, he can't actually be saved from the eternal grave, and also can never be fully enlightened because he's never seen the world, which I just have to say. If this started when he was 4 years old and you care that much about his religious upbringing, I know toddlers who say prayers before they go to bed, so I feel like if it's this big of a concern for them now, they could have instilled it in him when he was tiny. I mean, I know I'm just being picky, and these lines obviously exist for like narrative and lyrical purposes, and a lot of the show doesn't make sense. But, you know, anyway, Uncle Ernie plays the French horn, and Tommy seems to respond to that, and they're like, Tommy, can you hear things? Tommy? And he doesn't respond. In the 2024 version specifically, they had him in church, and he responded to the organ. And then he went home, and Uncle Ernie, or Cousin Kevin, who is it? It's Uncle Ernie, is playing the French horn, and he responds to that as well. So it's clear that he responds to music and vibrations because he is music boy. His whole life is vibrations. But yeah, anyway. So older Tommy reappears, and he sings at younger Tommy the see me, feel me, touch me, heal me motif that's gonna come up a lot throughout. It's unclear whether this cry for help is asking his younger self to help his older self, or both of his selves asking everybody else on stage to help him because nobody seems willing to even try to connect with him. I think it can be both. I think I do prefer it being from himself to himself, and the majority of stagings it is from himself to himself, so that's the version I'm going to believe exists, because later in the show the roles reverse and it becomes little Tommy asking big Tommy for help, and that, like, I don't think symbiotic is the right word, but that pull between the different versions of oneself with the fundamental need to be cared for underneath all of that is very intriguing to me thematically, and that sometimes he uses a future, older image of himself to dream his way out of a bad situation, and other times he retreats into a younger version of himself to dream his way out of a bad situation, which kind of further speaks to his like inner world and inner turmoil and individualistic need to handle everything by himself because nothing outside of himself is willing to offer that support. And I like that better than him just asking people to heal him, because that feels a lot more ethical in a disability sense. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Church. Christmas. Now, next scene, we see that Uncle Ernie is really intoxicated. Tommy's sitting there rocking back and forth by himself, and his parents are getting ready to go out, and they're going, do you think it's okay if we leave Tommy with Uncle Ernie? He's kind of really intoxicated. And then they're like, that's fine, and they do it anyway. And then as soon as the walkers are gone, Ernie's like, oh, you're not gonna see or hear anything, and you won't yell. So he takes advantage of Tommy. And then when the walkers return, Tommy looks at himself in the mirror. Older Tommy sings, see me, touch me, feel me, etc. Little Tommy. Then we meet Cousin Kevin as babysitter option number 2. Cousin Kevin is the self-described school bully, and he says that Tommy won't be much fun being blind, deaf, and dumb, but he'll try to play with him anyway, and does a lot of sadistic torture stuff. Also, refers to Tommy as a freak in this song. Disability language. We're looking at it. At the end of this, he gets bored, so as a joke, he plops Tommy down in front of a pinball machine at the youth center, and then Tommy begins to play and kicks major butt. And lots of kids come over to watch him be really good at pinball, and everybody's freaking out, and then Big Tommy appears and he sings Sensation, and you just get the vibe that, like, this is the first time that Tommy has felt joy or, like, usefulness, or like he mattered in some way. It also, this song ends with the lyrics, I am the light. That will also make more sense later. Everybody's really excited at this breakthrough, obviously. So they bring Tommy back to the doctors, but he shows no difference, and the parents are very upset. And on the way home, Captain Walker is approached by some dudes who promise that they know a lady who can do a miracle cure on his son because she brings eyesight to the blind and speech to those who don't talk, etc., etc. Cannot express to you how much this song feels like the exact inverse of the Christmas song Mary Did You Know? fascinating concept. Now, Captain is skeptical about this, but he's desperate, so he agrees to go, and this is where we meet the Acid Queen. Her name starts with a G and is a slur for Romani people, so we're not gonna say that. But the Acid Queen is a sex worker who is addicted to a lot of drugs. Rock and roll, baby. And so she says that she can cure Tommy by giving him drugs, presumably LSD being the drug of choice, though she's addicted to heroin canonically, I believe. Anyway, she tries to coerce them into it, also might be trying to coerce Tommy into sex as well, depending on how you interpret it and how it's staged, but Captain ends up grabbing Tommy and leaving. In the original album and in the film, he does do all of the drugs and seems to physically respond to them. They changed this for the musical. I agree with the choice to change it, especially because during the scene in the album and in the film, he's an adult, and here he is 10 years old. But yeah, so now it's 1958. This is Pinball Wizard. If you know anything from this album or anything about it at all, you know Pinball Wizard. And basically people line up from all around to watch him play pinball, and the local kids all call him the deaf, dumb, and blind kid. And he's a local celebrity. Wow, go Pinball Wizard. And that's the end of Act 1. And I will say, this was one of the most inaccessibly staged numbers of the 2024 show. However, I was screaming the whole time. It was fantastic. Anyway, Act 2. It's 1960. Tommy is getting even more popular. Look at him go. At this point, the local kids kind of bully him, but also kind of admire him. It's in that weird territory where it might be lovingly teasing, but he's not consenting to it, so it's really unclear. Anyway, Captain Walker comes running in and is like, I found a new doctor who can cure the boy. And so they go to this fancy new doctor who has what I'm assuming has to be an MRI scanner and whatnot. We see little Tommy sing the See Me to the big Tommy here, because little Tommy is a medical trauma, so it would make sense that big Tommy feels very connected to little Tommy in this specific moment. The specialist tells them that Tommy is physically able to hear and see. The issue here is a mental block that Tommy has that he needs to break through himself. He also says, the specialist also says, imagine though the shock from isolation if he suddenly could hear and speak and see. And his parents are like, oh, I wonder what's happening in his head. Great. At this point, Mrs. and Captain Walker sing I Believe My Own Eyes, which Townsend wrote specifically for the musical and is a very Broadway sounding, and so it feels out of place. During which the song, the parents are to face the reality that Tommy may never be cured, and he needs attention and care our love can't provide, implying that they are giving up trying to cure him and want to put him in an institution. In the 2024 version, I also appreciated this. They clarified this by having them literally get in the car, bring him to check out an institution, and then coming home and packing up his suitcase at the end of the song, which I thought was very great because it is not clear what is going on in the original production. Also, again, timeline reminder. Tommy is currently 20 years old and has been in this catatonic state for 16 years at this point. Most of the lyrics in this song are them mourning the lives they could have had, but then they didn't, and they think it's time to stop trying to imagine a cure for their son. It kind of talks about how they're personally impacted by his disability, all that good stuff. Also during the scene, little Tommy is in the mirror looking out at big Tommy. At the end of this song, Tommy watches his reflection in the mirror, and Mrs. Walker keeps trying to drag him away from it, and he keeps trying to move towards it, and she gets really angry, and so she smashes the mirror. And we see him then look at his fragmented image in the broken mirror, and then he's just like broken out of his trance, kind of. I think it's like the idea is that he PTSD'd all the way around back to the starting point, sort of. And he's delighted by all of this, and he sings a song called I'm Free, which includes lyrics such as freedom tastes of reality and freedom lies here in normality. This song is also a bop though. It's objectively a bop. Now everybody comes from near and far to witness his miraculous change, and Uncle Ernie sells a photo of Tommy to a reporter, and his story of the miracle cure gets printed in every paper, and it becomes really, really idolized. And then we see him playing pinball with a helmet that temporarily cuts off his sight and hearing in front of massive stadiums full of people who are like, how can we follow you? How we want to follow you? You know, what can we do? Reporters then interview his parents, who say they prefer to call it a transformation rather than a cure, because what happened is that he simply got well. That's the extent of it, and they act like they never once gave up hope. LOL. And then in the song Tommy's Holiday Camp, people are flocking to the stadium to go see Tommy, and Uncle Ernie is selling Tommy merchandise. Stickers, t-shirts, shades, and earplugs. Tiny mirrors that you can smash to have your own transformation. Lots of using Tommy's fame and popularity for his own personal gain. Next, we meet Sally Simpson, a teenage fan who's upset that her father says she can't go to Tommy's performance, so she sneaks out and she goes anyway, and when she's there, she climbs on stage and she puts her scarf around his neck, and then she touches his face, and then gets knocked off, and then the guards beat her mercilessly. There's a couple different versions. So the original production, he like literally whacked her off and like seemed kind of aware of it, which I thought was bizarre. In the 2024 version, he had his helmet on, and so she touched him and he just like moved a little bit in reaction to being touched, and that accidentally whacked her off, which I personally think thematically works better, because after this, you know, he's watching the guards beat her and he jumps off the stage and he cradles her in his arms and he says, you know, I'm done, I want to go home, with the implication that this has all gotten out of hand, his fame has gotten out of hand, and he doesn't want to do this anymore. And I think having him accidentally hit her and then watching the guards beat her up without having the ability to stop it in any way, because he's on a delay and the guards are too into what they're doing, I personally like that staging choice better. But yeah, he says he's gonna go home now, but also like if everybody wants to go home with him, they can. At his house, they have this dialogue in front of reporters where Sally asks Tommy how they can be more like him, and Tommy's like, why would you want to be more like me? For 15 years, I was waiting for what you've already got. And she's like, what's that? And he responds, all this. In my dreams, I was seeing it, hearing it, feeling it. Those are the true miracles, and you have them already. And she says, I don't understand. And he says, the point is not for you to be more like me. The point is, I'm finally more like you. I can't be who you want me to be. And he kind of talks about how all of this is just pinball, and he was just dealing with a lot of pain, and now he's not dealing with pain anymore, and it's not some sort of magical fairy tale that you should want to emulate, and he wants them to get off his back and not treat him like some sort of god messiah figure, because they need to recognize what's inside them to find their own enlightenment and salvation, and not try to find it in a false idol like him. But everybody gets really angry at this because they want a different message from him, and they leave, and Sally is the last one to go. And then he looks in the mirror at little Tommy, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, is he gonna relapse? Oh no, terrible. And then the Tommies reach out to each other and do their see me, feel me thing to each other, and then the little one fades away, so that big Tommy is forced to look at himself as just himself, and then he turns to his family and sings the listening to you, I get the music, gazing at you, I get the heat, following you, I climb the mountain, I get excitement at your feet, refrain that I totally forgot to mention before this point, that it appears throughout as much as the see me, feel me does. Sort of. It's a little less frequent. But it kind of denotes who the teacher is in a more religious sense. The text of it implies the biblical Moses climbing Mount Sinai, kind of meant to serve the purpose of whoever sings it is not enlightened until they sing this. So like we see little Tommy sing it to big Tommy as if big Tommy is his guide, and then the two Tommies sing it together, and then here Tommy sings it to his family begins to sing it with him, and then the ensemble joins in and they all walk to the edge of the stage looking out at the audience in a way that implies that the fourth wall is a mirror and they're looking at the audience as the last group of people that need to follow the teachings in order to be enlightened. And that's the show for ya. The main messaging of it, as I understand it, kind of centers around the creation of false idols in a quest for enlightenment, and how the thing that frees you and makes you enlightened is inside of you all along, and also how outside pressures alienate you from yourself and enlightenment. Like we see how the parents tell Tommy he didn't see or hear anything, and that manifests as him no longer actually seeing or hearing, which blocks his ability to fully recognize his own selfhood or whatever. Now, if you're a fan of the original album, you may be thinking, that's not the ending I remember. What are you talking about? And that is because the ending of the show is different from the album and the film. In the original ending, Tommy tells his followers that to be more like them, they should become blind, deaf, and mute, and find their heightened sense of enlightenment via that. In the film, they specifically sell glasses that have earplugs and a mouth cork attached to them, and then he has them put those on and then go to pinball machines and start playing, and it's really culty and creepy, and then the crowd gets really angry and they turn on him, rather than him telling them explicitly not to do that in the show. The original ending has a sort of energy of Tommy being free and escaping everything and climbing mountains like a prophet, versus the show's more bittersweet version where he stays home, back where he started, but emotionally changed and more mature and like actually appreciates his parents. They're obviously very different messages, but I do think at the end of the day they do kind of convey the same theme, but either way, Townsend wanted the ending to be somewhat unclear to give listeners the ability to make up their own minds about it and reflect on the messages of the piece. Now, in regards to other changes, I mentioned some of them throughout. Most notably, in the film, the captain is killed and the lover becomes Tommy's stepfather instead of the other way around. Really weird, hated that. There was also lyrical changes between the album and the film. Many of those lyrical changes did stay for the stage musical as well, though the new song created for the film did not make it into the musical. The musical in general took little to no inspiration from the film, instead choosing to focus on the original source material, which is great because the film is 10 times more ableist, but we'll get to that. And we will also talk about audience opinions later, but every time something is changed for the next iteration, a portion of the audience will complain about how it's softened or whatever. And it seems to me more that Townsend has grown as the piece has grown, and he wants to change aspects of the messaging a little bit to kind of fit his new worldview. And this, to me, like every piece of it has felt like the next draft, if that makes sense. So I honestly see the musical as the final draft of the original things. And actually in the documentary about creating Tommy for Broadway, Elton John specifically said he felt that Townsend never felt Tommy was finished, and that he could like let it go until it had made it to the stage. Now when it comes to changes for the current revival, there appear to have been a handful of script revisions, most notably rewriting the end of We're Not Gonna Take It, which is the final song where they're like, we don't like you, Tommy, because the R word for assault is used in there a bunch of times and they took it out. I personally think the idea of Tommy's followers acknowledging that they don't care about Tommy as a person and instead just want to violate and take things from him and then leave him because that's how we treat celebrities is really interesting. So I think this lyrical change is weird and I don't love it. And they also removed the Tommy's Holiday Camp song, which is again weird because Tommy's Holiday Camp is an important demonstration of how people are exploiting Tommy and capitalizing off of him, and so I also think that it should be in there. It also clarifies what's going on in the show a good deal. It's like dramaturgically important. But before we get into all of that, let's start at the very beginning of Tommy's history. Now, The Who was a rock band that formed in 1964, made up of 4 guys: Pete Townsend, who played the guitar and wrote most of the songs, Roger Daltrey, who was the main vocalist, John Entwistle, who was the bassist, and Keith Moon on the drums. They became very popular very quickly, completely changed the game of the industry and the genre, but for a while they were just releasing singles and were struggling to get to chart toppers, which is when Townsend began writing Tommy, which was not technically the first rock opera, but it was the first thing to be marketed as a rock opera and is one of, if not the most famous rock operas of all time. People were very displeased about the rock opera wording, particularly when they performed Tommy at the Met for 2 performances in 1970. That was a whole thing. But Tommy's success created the age of the concept album, and releasing albums became the standard rather than releasing singles, which was the standard before that. At the time, nobody was really writing about trauma or hard things, so this was a really big deal on a lot of levels. Tommy went through many iterations, adding and removing and reworking songs. It was originally going to be back and forth between the horrors of Tommy's life and then the rich beauty of his inner fantasy world. There's actually a series of Rolling Stone articles where Townsend tells the story of what Tommy is, and it's so funny because each one, like after another, is completely inconsistent with the others, and he later said that he looked back at those articles to help guide what he was doing while finishing the piece because he was coming up with most of that on the spot, which I really respect. I should also mention that he was 23 years old when he wrote this thing, which is just wild. It also explains why it's changed so much over the last however many years. But they began recording it in September of 1968, finishing in March of 1969. They also planned to get an orchestra involved, but then that didn't happen, so things ended up being kind of haphazard, and I love that about it, honestly. And then they released it in May of 1969. It reached number 2 on UK charts and number 4 in the United States. Now, when it comes to inspiration, there are a handful of things that could have either been deliberately mentioned as references or are heavily implied. The first is the whole post-Vietnam cultural angst and hippie culture. That seems pretty self-explanatory. The Come to My House section specifically is meant to somewhat mock the hippie movement of let's all live together as one happy family that was never meant genuinely and always backfired. Kind of gives the same energy of like the you call yourself a community organizer but you're not on speaking terms with your roommates energy. It was meant that. The second inspiration sort of branches off of that a little bit because everybody was looking for some semblance of answers during this time, and Townsend got really into the teachings of an Indian mystic named Meher Baba. This album is dedicated to him, and The Who also has a song called Baba O'Reilly that refers to him. And Baba became famous in the US and the UK in the mid-60s because he asked his disciples to spread his teachings about how drugs are spiritually damaging. His spiritual transformation, as he referred to it, connect the dots back to how Captain Walker says it's not a magical cure, but it's a transformation. Whoa, word choice. It began when he met a saint who kissed him on the forehead, and then he began a 9-month-long trance where he lost full consciousness of his body, and he then became a spiritual leader and started gathering disciples and doing charity work and whatnot. And about a decade or so later, he also took a vow of silence that lasted for the rest of his life, which was 44 years. He first used chalk and slate to communicate, then an alphabet board, and then later only hand gestures, and he refused to communicate in written language. He also believed that people who from the outside seemed irrational or insane were actually spiritual spiritually gifted and on a higher spiritual plane of existence than everybody else. And he also believed many other things. Obviously, these are just the specific ones that very clearly obviously link to the storytelling that we get in Tommy. Another inspiration is that much of this story is the story of Townsend's actual life. And then the fourth thing is that in 1968, The Who went on tour with a singer named Paul Jones, who had just been in a film called Privilege that was about a pop star that people started to worship as a sort of messiah, but then became disillusioned and turned on the pop star. Also, the pinball machine situation was kind of an accident. There was a rock music critic named Nick Cohen who really loved pinball, and when he came to listen to the work in progress at the studio, he said that it felt kind of somber and spiritually heavy and boring, and so Townsend was like, well, I have this idea to make him really good at pinball. So what do you think of that? And that's how they won him over and got their good review and how we got Pinball Wizard. The album was originally going to be called Deaf, Dumb, and Blind Boy. That was later changed. Good on them for that. And in an interview with Keith Altham from the New Music Express in November of 1968, Townsend says, "I wanted to get an appreciation of things through the eyes of someone or something that was not preconditioned by the bias of the senses. I thought of looking at life through the eyes of animals, adolescents, and finally the deaf, dumb, and blind boy. The boy registers everything in the form of musical vibrations. That is, if he has struck a blow, he doesn't feel pain. He experiences something like the chord of G. In the beginning, he is abused by his family, by an uncle, and given drugs like LSD to help his condition. Because of his disabilities, he develops a technique which enables him to become a pinball playing champion. His sight begins to come back and he becomes obsessed with his own reflection in a mirror. Then his hearing is restored when his mother shatters the mirror. He finally ends up as a kind of national hero who lectures on his disabilities and how he overcame them." We're gonna table all disability related comments until we get to that point in the video. I just wanted you to hear that. There are also some cool discussions with Townsend about the medium of rock and roll and how the genre is specifically focused around, like, here's a tough thing to think about, but let's just vibe for now and then we'll process it later, which is sort of why the end of this piece is more of a fade out than any definitive closure. And it also is a genre that is very specific to a semblance of teenage angst and anger and getting out big feelings about tough things in the most chaotic, weird, strange way possible, which sort of creates a space where that behavior is socially acceptable. And as a genre, it questions what is normal and what it means to be normal, which I think is interesting because my biggest frustration with rock musicals in general is that the genre tends to just throw out every single minority issue and taboo topic together without actually like thinking about what those mean or the responsibility of telling stories around those topics, and then get praised for their bravery in doing so despite typically causing even more stereotypes and harm, which, like, yes, we're talking about it for the first time really, which is really cool, but also is all publicity good publicity, you know? So I think this breakdown of it, discussing how it's not meant to solve problems, but just throw them out into the ether to make you think about them, is interesting because on one level I am totally for that, and I think it's cool that that's how this genre functions, but on another level, I have seen the active negative impact this has had on real discussions of these issues because performativity is always easier and more comfortable than actual discussion and acknowledgement. So I'm not sure where I stand on that, but it's an interesting thought that I'm pondering as I work through this, so I shared with you. Now, a few months before releasing the entire album, they released Pinball Wizard as a single, and a whole lot of critics thought that it was really insensitive and sick. The word sick was used a lot. The tide on this began to turn toward calling it groundbreaking after their press launch performance on May 1st, about 2 weeks before the album release, which makes sense given that The Who was mostly known for their just incredible performances. But still, after the album release, BBC Radio specifically said that the use of a disabled character was sensationalistic and in very bad taste. Watching the band members talk about this in the Tommy documentary, I get the energy that they feel like those reviewers didn't quite get that it's supposed to make you uncomfortable and make you think, and that they were criticizing the piece at face value rather than the overall meaning of the piece. I personally think that both things can be true at the same time, which is kind of where I'm sitting in this entire video. I will say though, the band did charity benefits in 1989 where people paid a lot of money to see them perform Tommy in its entirety, and the money was then donated to a charity for autistic and abused children, which I do think is cool. But anyway, Tommy came out in 1969. The first staging of it was in 1971 by the Seattle Opera. There was also a Canadian ballet the same year, and then in 1978 there was a staged production. It also seems like a lot of people in other directions tried to stage it as well. I'm really curious as to how the copyright for all of this would have worked, but that's beside the point. Now in 1975, 6 years after the release of the album, we get the film, which is directed by Ken Russell. The entire thing exists for free on the YouTubes if you feel bored, but also I wouldn't really recommend it. I think the best overarching statement I can give is, wow, this was made in the 70s. It really took the light acid trip energy of the original music and pumped it up by like 1,000%, and then threw in Elton John, Tina Turner, Eric Clapton, and Jack Nicholson and the entirety of The Who. Yeah, they shuffled around a lot of songs, they changed a lot of lyrics. The song that I talked about earlier that feels like an inverse Mary Did You Know is sung not about the Acid Queen, but instead at church about a Marilyn Monroe statue, and they're praying to the Marilyn Monroe statue, and the church is all full of disabled people who are worshiping Marilyn Monroe, hoping that she will cure them. So that's a thing. Also, the mom and stepfather are disasters who kind of hate each other, which really changes the vibe. I think if they're leaning into the idea that the world is horrible for Tommy and it's better to escape into his inner, you know, his inner personal world, this does add to that, but it also just feels weird because then like no relationships are healthy, or even, I mean, is it really healthy in the musical? It's sketchy, but it's, anyway. Overall, it leaned really hard into the religion and enlightenment themes, as well as the theme of exploitation. They had Tommy, who was played by lead singer Daltrey, preaching using hand signals, which is reminiscent of Mayor Baba, and he becomes a sort of patron saint of the disableds, sort of. They're like the primary group that goes after him for answers, and then all the non-disableds follow after that, which I think, if the narrative is that disabled people are closer to God and Tommy is God, it would make sense that they follow him first and then everybody else needs to learn to live like the disableds in order to be enlightened, but I'm still really confused as to what's happening here or what that artistic vision was. But it does appear that they cast actual disabled people, I think. So for the 70s, that's a big deal. So points for that. But the thing that bothered me most about this film is that the main purpose, as I understand it, of Tommy's catatonia is that it is catatonia. He is not literally blind and deaf and trying to interact with the world through the lens of those disabilities. He is simply unresponsive, and so they assume that he must therefore be deafblind when he's not. So Daltrey's Tommy acting in a way that I can only describe as like little Helen Keller from the 1962 Miracle Worker film, like making facial expressions and reacting to sensory input and walking around and trying to find and feel things, completely misses the point, which feels silly to say given that obviously the creators of the story themselves were involved in creating the film and were in the film. Like, they know their piece better than I do, but it felt like the main purpose of his disability was lost. Not that disability should ever have purpose, but if you're gonna make it have purpose, at least get it right, you know? Then, in July of 1992, we got the La Jolla premiere of Tommy. This production, as we said earlier, was directed by Des McAnuff, and Townsend was involved for the entire process of it. After La Jolla, it then opened on Broadway in March of 1993, and it ran for 2 years at the St. James Theatre. This production got 11 Tony nominations, winning 5, including Best Direction of a Musical and Best Original Score. They also set a box office record with nearly 500,000 in ticket sales the day after opening. Also, Michael Cerveris played the original Tommy. He was one of the Sweeneys that we talked about my Sweeney Todd analysis, so I think that's fun that we're having a little full circle theatrical moment. McAnuff deliberately did not borrow from the film and worked extensively with Townsend to make it a piece that they both could be proud of. One specific thing to note is that it is deliberately super fast-paced without room for applause because they want you to keep your concentration within the story to give it that same visceral effect the original story has the first time that you hear it. And they also made the audio louder over the course of previews to keep with that visceral feel. This production was beloved, but also many people were angry, saying that they had softened it by changing the ending and also by not explicitly showing the fiddle around CSA scene, to which McAnuff said, "That's a real little boy up there. Does anyone actually need me to abuse that child to get the idea across?" And we were well aware that there would be audience members who felt that they kind of owned this piece, which is an important concept that I refer to as the trap of nostalgia, which we're going to get to a little bit later. But I also think that a crucial part of this is that art hits you differently at different ages. And for people who were shocked by it in the 60s and then loved it and listened to it over and over and over and over again, that initial jolt of it is not going to hit you when you see it in the theater 25 years later. So it was always going to feel softer and too different to people because it's a different era and it will therefore feel like a different piece. And actually, to add to this, I felt like it was too soft when I went to see it. I was like, they could have really hit harder on these themes. They could have made this more uncomfortable. They could have acknowledged those kinds of things, and I was annoyed by it. And I had a good time, but like, I also was like, this feels a little softened from what I expected from this musical, which is really interesting because I've only been studying it for a few weeks and I felt that change because it was really harsh when I first looked into it. Now I'm like, yeah, do more, you know? Which I think is really interesting. So I can only imagine you know, what happens when it's been 60 years of thinking about this piece, you know, and like how you feel when you go see it now. In 2008, there was a 15-year reunion concert to raise money for Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS. This entire concert is also on YouTube. It's like halfway staged and there's gorgeous production. So if you do want to check out the show in a way that you can control the volume and take breaks and not spend a lot of money or be in New York City, that would be my vote. The sound mixing is slightly wonky, so you may need the lyrics open on the side to know what's going on at some points, but I would definitely recommend the concert because it's a really great time. Other notable productions include the April 2018 version at Denver Center for the Performing Arts, where the set was effectively a dollhouse, which is really cool. And in 2019, there was the version of the Kennedy Center, which included Casey Cott, Christian Borle, and Mandy Gonzalez. And then, in 2023, we get the 30-year revival of the show at Goodman Theater in Chicago, which then transferred to the Niederlander Theater on Broadway, where it opened on March 28th and is currently running. Now, this revival has been billed as Tommy for a New Generation, which is an interesting concept because, on one side, period pieces that may have been harmful can and should be reworked to be less harmful. Like huge sections of Showboat, for example, have been rewritten between revivals in regards to race. Annie Get Your Gun has as well. And the recent changes to The Music Man don't really sell the viability of that idea as much, but that's a more recent example of that happening, even if it was kind of unsuccessful. But on the other side, it can also be hard to change things within period pieces to be less harmful because they are period pieces, and showing what happened during that era can be important. The example of this I often give is Newsies, where crip or cripple is used 5 times, once by Jack referring to Crutchy as a crip, once by a kid in the refuge, and then the other 3 are from the mouths of the villains. Now the story takes place in 1899 where that language was acceptable, but now it's a slur unless it's reclaimed by the disabled community. Crip is effectively reclaimed at this point, and like crip theory, crip time are actual genuine things, but that's complicated. We're not going to get into that now. If I were to update the Newsies script, I would personally keep the uses of the cripple language as said by the villains. It denotes clear ableism, discrimination, and dehumanization in a period-accurate way that does not feel out of place. But I would remove the other 2 uses of it when it's used in a neutral or a positive setting, because that always has the chance of accidentally telling the audience that, oh, if it's used with love, it's an okay thing to say, which is complicated and can be debated, and we don't want to spoon-feed media literacy to audiences, but the fight for media literacy does not need to be fought over the use of a singular word that can easily be replaced with a word like kid. So that's not a significant change to the script, but it does update a period piece in a natural way to remove the harm of the use of the word when necessary, and when it is used, having that be deliberate, all while preserving the original meaning of each line. But updating this show in particular is interesting because, first of all, it's music with a rhyme scheme that is already really well known. So changing language is a lot more difficult. Not impossible, but definitely more difficult. This music was also originally one of the first places with an open conversation about trauma and PTSD and bullying and abuse, things that we now talk about pretty regularly, so they feel like they have less edge than they did back then, meaning that just pointing them out and giving people space to ponder them on their own is no longer effective as a narrative tool. It needs to be explored a bit further in order to not feel performative and lazy, which is actually something that Townsend has mentioned about the piece and how it doesn't have space for explanation or discussion around these serious issues, and he kind of wishes that it does now. I did stumble into a discussion somewhere about how they did discuss the concept of changing the deaf, dumb, and blind language at one point, but never actually legitimately considered it. I think if any change could have happened, I would vote deaf, mute, and blind, which is still not great, but it is better. But then at the same time, that language was more or less medically appropriate back then, becoming outdated, but not quite there, kind of like how we feel about Asperger's today. And I also think that it is kind of meant to be somewhat crass in a similar way to how middle schoolers might throw around queer slurs on the playground, particularly because that language in the script is only ever used by the young people and Tommy himself. It's also a period piece, and I would hope that at this point we do know that this language is outdated and harmful. But then, and we'll talk about this again later, the target audience for the show might not see it as a period piece as much. They see it as the good old days, or they might not view the overall story and language as outdated because it was a huge part of their lives for a very long time. So if I were staging this for a bunch of folks in my generation who may not be familiar with the Tommy music before their first version of the show, I would feel a lot more comfortable keeping that language in than I do with it as it is right now, if that makes any sense. When it comes to this New York Times quote about the revival, the question is one that theater makers across the country are grappling with. Should revived works be altered to align with the worldviews and sensitivities of present-day audiences? In Tommy, McAnuff and Townsend's answer was largely no. And I sort of agree. We're going to talk about this more in a bit. I think if the staging intends to keep it in the era it was in, which is 1945 to 1965, significant changes to the source material would make it anachronistic, wishful thinking about the time period, and would alter the intended message of the piece. It would also be near impossible given how the script is currently structured and the popularity of the songs themselves. But at the same time, The creators note that the story is condemning, not condoning what happens to Tommy. I, as a media analyst, know that as well. But can we trust the audience to know that? And also, what harm would be caused by them not knowing that? And is that trade-off worth it? And could small changes be made to minimize that harm, such as, say, changing the name of the Acid Queen to not being a slur, particularly because a lot of people don't know that the word is a slur, so maybe changing that would be really helpful as a teaching moment that doesn't actually impact anything else in the production. I also heard a lot of audience members say some really ableist stuff behind me, and I was like, oh my gosh. But that being said, changing the script is only a very teeny tiny portion of updating a piece for present-day audiences. Other things also can and should be updated, such as the way a show is marketed, the way a show is discussed publicly, the way a show is cast, the way that it is staged, all things that don't really seem to have happened at all whatsoever with this revival. The first thing is the casting call, which described Tommy as male presenting, 20s to early 30s, open ethnicity. After witnessing a fatal shooting as a young child, Tommy's left deaf, blind, and mute. It's important to note that outdated disability language is often left in casting calls, but that does not mean that that is a good thing, especially because in this case, we do know the show. This character is not actually deaf, blind, and mute, so that doesn't need to be in the casting call. Townsend has referred to him also as autistic for decades. I would consider him to be somewhere on that weird blurry line between complex PTSD and autism. We'll get into the diagnostics of that more later, but he's never really actually unable to hear or see. He is just unresponsive. And he may not be registering or processing what he hears and sees, that's unclear, but I wouldn't consider that to be accurate diagnostic language for him at all whatsoever. And specifically the language of Tommy is left, insert disability, that he doesn't even have, implies that no attention was put into aspects of his disability, because if it was, they would have phrased that casting call a lot differently. The way that the cast and crew are discussing the show and marketing is completely unchanged from what was being said about Tommy during the creation of the initial show, and even when the original album came out. So that has also not been updated at all, and I think it probably should be. There's also no scholar, dramaturg, or accessibility coordinator or DEI person at all listed in the creative team. I personally think that every show could benefit from having a dramaturg present, but especially one that is dealing with clear minority issues. I acknowledge that this is one of the cases where people are like, well, they don't have to because it's not technically disability, because the disability is not real, which grinds my gears, because if it's close enough to be disability for people to be thinking about it as disability, you have the ability to cause harm and you should just hire a coordinator, but whatever. Either way, they should have had somebody like that on the team, which again, if you are updating and reworking your show for a new generation, to me, that automatically translates to requiring a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion that's clearly not happening here, which is also irresponsible because there are several different minorities in this cast that also deserve general DEI support. I've also heard from several sources that during their run at the Goodman Theater, they had to cancel the sensory-friendly performances they do for every run of the show happening there because the staging was so fundamentally inaccessible and impossible to even remotely modify to be accessible, and there was no willingness from the team to try to do that. And there's also no plan for changes to be made in that regard from Goodman to Broadway. I didn't see it in Chicago, so I do not know if that's the case in comparison to my experience seeing the show. But let's talk about my experience, actually. I will also say that before going, I had heard from several non-disabled people that the lighting and sound was too much for them and they had to leave at intermission, and so I was very nervous since I'm rather strobe sensitive, but academic honesty and whatnot. So I did go, I went. I scheduled my whole day around like prepping for it and taking as much care of myself as possible. I scheduled the day after it to be the same. I medicated a lot before and after, and I brought my larger emergency medical kit to the theater and 3 different layers of earplugs. Also, since I work in the industry now, I will say I haven't had an actual medical emergency at a show since I was in like high school for a multitude of reasons. So I wasn't actually super concerned, but I had heard so much about the inaccessibility of the show that I went overkill because I was really nervous and I knew I was seeing it alone. And I was like, I need to be able to get myself home alive. In regards to specific accessibility questions, my access review of the production is up on Instagram and on my website. I will link it below. That documents various lighting cues, where the bathrooms are, what the access options are, and whatnot. So if that's helpful for you, it does exist. Anyway, this was one of the most inaccessibly staged productions I've ever seen, but obviously that was to be expected given the genre and the staging and the lighting expectations that come along with said genre. Also, historically, Tommy was really the first show to majorly use projections and popularize them as a concept, so I knew that whatever tech was going to happen in this revival was going to be big and a lot and flashy, because that's what the thing is known for being. That being said, and I do hate to say this, I had a great time. In like how The Greatest Showman is a really fun movie to watch and sing and dance along to, as long as you don't think too hard about the complex, about how it is just completely utterly rewriting history in a very terrifying way. This is also definitely a show where you should not at all ever listen to anything anybody around you in the audience is saying, because it will definitively be very ableist. But watching it with earplugs in whilst ignoring all societal implications was a really fun time. I mean, it was really flashy and stroby and god awful loud, and you couldn't understand the words they were saying, and there were some serious caricatures of disabled body language. But with my earplugs and my anti-nausea medication in the last row of the mezzanine, I don't know, man. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it's because I've been studying this thing for so long in the void, and it was really cool to get to actually see it live, and I generally just love live theater that it's like no matter what, so it's really hard for me to not like a show. But I had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed myself. And if this is helpful at all from that great a distance in the last row of the mezzanine, the sensory accessibility of the show is about the same as the sensory accessibility of being in the 5th row of 6 or anywhere for Here Lies Love, except this is significantly longer and has way more gunshots, and you can't figure out what any of the words are that they are saying. So do with that what you will. In talking to other audience members and reading reviews, the general consensus is that the plot is really unclear and confusing, the show is an absolute sensory overload, and there is so much going on all of the time that you never know where your focus is supposed to be. Also, that the original "this story deals with issues nobody talks about" thing is no longer the case, so it hits really differently in a more modern context, and the show is primarily meant for the older generations who already have the nostalgia for the piece, and new people coming into it will just be overwhelmed and confused, which every young person I talk to who has seen the show has said as much. I am the only young person I have met who genuinely had a good time. And that's because I've been researching it for a long time. Several reviewers also questioned the why as to the point of this revival, which one review referred to as more a reanimation than a revival, which I would agree with. Much of the staging is the same as the original production, and it sits different in a modern context. One piece of that which stood out particularly to me is the various moments where Tommy is stimming, because they choreographed it to be angular and artistic, but that meant it didn't actually look like what stimming looks like. And that's something that audiences, I don't know, 30 years ago probably wouldn't majorly notice, but stimming is much more in the cultural consciousness now, and it clearly made people uncomfortable. I don't think that they could pinpoint that was precisely why they were uncomfortable with that being on stage, but I noticed that when he was stimming, people looked particularly uncomfortable. Also because the staging of this show is weirdly similar to Curious Incident. I am quite sure, and have been for a while, that Curious was somehow inspired by this, because why else do two famous shows centering a disabled boy using bodies, projections, lighting, and sound in a nearly identical way not be somewhat related to each other? So avid theater goers will be making connections between other pieces of, and not even avid theater goers, like Curious Incident is also really popular regionally, so they probably had seen it like as a high school production. People are going to be making connections between this show and other pieces of disabled media, where while Curious does somewhat caricature disabled aesthetics as well in non-disabled bodies, Curious does look a lot more natural than this show does, which made this stimming feel uncomfortable. And I think the aspects of it being mostly reused staging and feeling more like a reanimation than a revival, it does beg the question of what a revival actually is. Like, is it bringing back an old show because we miss it, or is it reimagining and recreating a show from the ground up? And that, I don't know. I think that's a conversation for another day, but I do think that if you're marketing your show as reimagined and then not reimagining it, we have an issue. Like, that's a problem. But anyway, I'll put my video of the curtain call here, and then let's talk about narratives and what to do with this absolute enigma of a show. Now, when it comes to conversations around the potential concerns for this piece, there are 3 different things that I am looking at that sometimes intersect with each other and sometimes don't. And that is the narratives in the script, the audience response to that script, and then this revival specifically. So let's start with disability narratives. Now, we've already talked about my issue with the deaf, dumb, blind language being used. I think we've covered that. I don't hate that it's in here, honestly. I'm pretty neutral on it. I'm a realist. I don't think there's a lot we can do to change it. Whatever. I am concerned that the audience does know it's outdated, but I I don't think this is really an important argument in comparison to the other issues that exist within this piece, so we're just gonna table it. I've gotten the vibe from interviews that the group seems to think that their portrayal of Tommy is okay because they're positive stereotypes about disabled people, so it's not causing harm. And I don't want to put words in their mouths, but that's just the understanding that I seem to be getting. And the problem with that is that it's just as dehumanizing and pushes people into tiny boxes just as much. Like the stereotype that women are nicer and friendlier and more communal than men are, or that gay men are fashionable, or that Asian people are good at math. They may seem like compliments, but they're still a problem and are still like causing a lot of issues. One that we see with Tommy specifically is the super crip trope, where he overcomes his disability to be a sort of savant in a specific thing, in this case pinball, to make up for the other things that he can't do, and still makes him inspiring and worthwhile and useful. We also see a serious romanticization of disability in Amazing Journey. Specifically, Tommy sings about how the disabled version of him is living in simplicity. Townsend has said that the work celebrates the value of suffering and the transformation of suffering into joy, which y'all know my feelings about glorifying suffering in the name of what might come from it, because you can learn things in lots of different ways that don't involve suffering. And with the spirituality of it all, the idea that Tommy understands the world on a different wavelength from the rest of the population, and that makes him more spiritually enlightened and closer to God, is also a thing. And it's hard because disabled people do see the world differently, and we do interact with the world differently. Like, I'm trying to be as nuanced as possible here, but then at the end of the day, he's being considered saintly solely because he is disabled, which is a problem. There's centuries of history in many cultures around viewing disabled people as closer to God, or connections between gods and the mortal plane. The history of prophets hearing voices of gods versus people looking at those as auditory hallucinations is a fascinating discussion in disability history, and also diagnostic ethics that I don't even want to dip my toe into. And I also know that this messaging for Tommy specifically comes from Meher Baba's teachings, but I do think that it's one thing to examine the stereotype of disabledness and godliness in history as it exists, and an entirely other thing to bring that into a modern day context. I would argue here that it is simply dehumanizing. And Tommy himself is dehumanized throughout the story. I mean, he never actually has any control over his body. His body never belongs to him, and he's only referred to with his name directly to his face and by a select few people. Nearly everybody else calls him Deaf, Dumb, and Blind Boy, the Boy, or Pinball Wizard. Basically, Tommy is a passive hero, and nothing happens to him, so it's very difficult to make the character be three-dimensional. Oh, look! The original Who are aware that it's a one-dimensional, stereotypical character. We also don't see Tommy live any sort of life while he's a disabled person. It is implied in Amazing Journey that he has an inner world that he's existing in, but we don't really see that. Like, deafblind people very much interact with the world and have happy, full lives. They don't just sit there and do nothing for 16 years. Disabled people adapt and accommodate ourselves, and the fact that Tommy's family didn't seem to bother trying to accommodate him for 16 years is wild to me. There's also the question of the way that this is staged, looking like every disabled person has an inner abled person who wants to jump out the moment that a cure comes along, rather than our inner selves very much being tied to our disabled experiences. Like, I do feel like I have like an abled Sydney as a shadow who every now and then will tell me how much more productive I would be if I were not disabled, but that doesn't feel like a part of me that exists. That feels like a version of me that society has created for me that I do my best to ignore because she's not helpful. I just misgendered my shadow self. Honestly, my shadow self would probably not be trans. Anyway, the overall narrative relies on the assumption that disabled people are constantly miserable and want to be cured, and that being cured is what makes us free, which is a problem. And the concept of disability itself is supposed to represent a limited point of view, which then is expanded once he is cured of that disability, which, first of all, if your metaphor is meant to use a disabled person to help a non-disabled person understand a concept, what are all the disabled people supposed to do with that information, and where do we fit in here? It also, with the enlightenment aspects, creates a concerning parallel between heaven and hell, with hell being his existence as a disabled person and heaven being his enlightened post-disability self, which is not great. But the primary concern here is the use of disability as metaphor to begin with. When it comes to media analysis of disability, the two biggest things that we talk about tend to overarch everything else are the narrative prosthesis and we are not a metaphor. If you want to learn more about disability tropes in media, I will link my video about them above. But basically, narrative prosthesis is when the disabled character or disability exists to prop up a wider narrative about what it means to be a human. Without the disability present, the story and the conflict of the story would not exist, but this disability is not not central to the story itself. The we are not a metaphor thing ties into this, and that literature relies on deviancy and difference for narrative expediency. Like, why explain he's a bad guy when you can just make him really tall and walking with a limp and breathing weirdly, for example. Narrative prosthesis also involves other people growing and changing because of a disabled person without the disabled person getting any real characteristics and being fairly one-dimensional. I feel like in this show, nobody has characteristics, so that doesn't bother me too much. The whole thing is weirdly flat. I do think that the focus on the mother's sorrow over her son's disability and how it impacts her is a bit odd and does fit into this prosthesis category, and I think the way that he is just like carried around and ever present but rarely involved or orchestrating the story actively in any capacity is also indicative of this trope, which is interesting because in one watch through I felt like his character was being used as a prosthetic, like propping up the story. I didn't actually have personality or anything. I was really frustrated, but in another watch through it felt like he was leading the whole thing and he had the most characterization out of everyone, and so I really have no idea how to feel about this because my opinions change every single time that I see it. But either way, the problem with these things is that it ascribes meaning to disability. A disability only exists for a reason. It's there to signal something to us. It has some sort of hidden message or explanation that we need to figure out and learn from. So for example, somebody who has only ever seen people with facial differences in movies as the villains may automatically distrust somebody they meet in real life with a facial difference, or somebody who is so used to seeing stories where a limp or use of a wheelchair means that the character is fundamentally missing something might treat somebody in real life who limps or uses a wheelchair as if their life is sad and unfulfilling. I see this to be the biggest problem within the theater world, where people have studied physicality and the meanings and implications of different physicality for so long that in their heads it does shortcut to meaning, which means that real people with disabled physicality in theatrical spaces are treated like characters in a play rather than real multi-dimensional people, and it's really weird. And obviously that's the whole point of Tommy's disability. It was created as a metaphor and it was created to have meaning, and the storyline is not meant to follow the lived experience of disabled people. It's meant to be an alternate reality of disability to serve a narrative purpose. And that is a problem, especially because of how pervasive this piece became and how little deafblind / PTSD representation we had at the time, and also have now, especially specifically in the theater canon, but that's a more complicated thing to get into. Where the aspect of metaphor and cure gets complicated for me is that the disability he does have is actually a very dynamic one. Most disabled people do not have disabilities that are consistent day to day. I'm not saying fluctuating disability is impossible for deaf or blind folks, but like in this specific case, what's going on for him is clearly PTSD and or depression-induced catatonia. Also, as I've said a few times, Townsend describes it as a form of traumatic autism. The confusing and messy overlaps between PTSD and autism are very much at play here. I really think it could be either and or both. That depends on what early Tommy looks like pre-catatonia. The kind of autism that Townsend is referring to in that quote is autism in the very literal sense of the word, as in like closed in and focused on oneself and unaware of the world around you, which was the original explanation of what autism looked like before it became a diagnostic term in the 40s. Also, catatonia covers a massive swath of experience and can sometimes involve not being able to really hear or see, or having that audio or visual input feel distorted and hard to understand. It really depends on the experience. It is very likely that over the course of 16 years he experienced different levels of awareness, and he may have experienced deafness and or blindness for periods of that time. But in regards to autism, they very much use the physicality typically associated with autism in this show. The narrative idea of a child appearing to be developing typically and then suddenly one day seeming like a completely different child is reminiscent of changeling tales, which have been how cultures have explained disability, most typically developmental disability, and in today's media culture is automatically connected to the artistic experience because of how it's used as a narrative tool, so the sociological breadcrumbs are totally there. But either way, in regards to him going from unresponsive to quite responsive, it seems like an exaggeration of reality. I wasn't able to find information on what coming out of a catatonic state feels or looks like, but as somebody who has randomly lost physical abilities for periods of time with my migraines, it's not a sudden snap out kind of thing. Parts of it snap out, parts fade, and you'll feel really weird and overwhelmed for a bit, which they did kind of include in the physicality in the 2024 version. That is new. I did appreciate that because it's not just like, I am fixed, it's like, whoa, I possess a body, you know? Also, I did some brief research out of curiosity. The earliest source that I could find for catatonia medication is from the 70s, with most research in the last 30 years, so that would not have been an option for him, and other treatments are from about then as well, so the doctor's inability to help him does check out if they were even diagnosing him correctly, which I don't think they were, because they also, like, right? The parents wanted to keep hidden what happened, so they weren't going to the doctors and being like, oh yeah, he witnessed a murder, you know? But also what happened to him does not seem super medically possible. It's not impossible, but it's very unlikely. But the point that I'm trying to make is that disabilities are dynamic, especially mental illnesses, and they ebb and they flow for a while, and his sudden fix because of a shattered mirror is unrealistic. But the idea that he could have gotten some sort of support at some point that helped him become more present isn't impossible. In this time period, I think it probably is, but as a general concept, I don't think that it is. In which case, part of disability rights is understanding that everybody deserves to feel their best, and that being impaired does not make a person any less than, or their life any less worth living, and they don't need a cure. And both of these things can be true, and that is okay. So like, yes, this miracle cure, whatever, is an exaggeration, but he could have changed over time and inhabited his body-mind differently. And at what point is, within the narrative, his disability not a metaphorical thing that appears and disappears when convenient for the plot, but a dynamic lived experience that one day took up a larger portion of his life than on another day, but that doesn't mean that it isn't a part of who he is and might not impact him in the future, you know? Especially because there is a concern at the end that he could potentially relapse. Like, he clearly is still struggling with his trauma. Like, it's not like he was just like, oh yes, my PTSD, gone. Like, it's more complicated than that. I do feel like this is a bit of a stretch. And obviously the thing is a metaphor. They said it's a metaphor, that's the point. But I think what I'm trying to say here is that I don't think he is disabled in one moment and non-disabled in another, because the lived experience of disability greatly impacts how you view the world and how you live day to day. And given that PTSD is a mental disability that he clearly has had throughout the entire course of the story, even through the end where his actions are impacted by the trauma he's gone through, I'm hesitant to say that he is actually entirely cured because we don't know that. And frankly, neither does he. And he probably doesn't remember a time where he was living without that traumatic event as a part of his story as well. So like, he has changed as a person, but I don't think that he's entirely cured. And I also think that the cure itself as a concept is interesting because one interpretation of it could be that his family giving up on trying to cure him and instead accepting him the way that he is, even though that means contemplating institutionalizing him, is what frees him. The way it's typically staged is that he goes from unaware to aware, but what if instead of a sharp shift, he began to exist in some shade between the two, like slowly getting his sea legs, as it were. And again, I don't think this is the intention of the piece, but if we were to play with it and mess with it and stage it differently, would this idea work? I don't know, because there's something fundamentally freeing about accepting that things are as they are and learning to accommodate what you have rather than hoping for some magic pill that suddenly makes it all better. And then this gets even more complicated because yes, Tommy is not well adjusted and condones a lot of this ableist language and these ableist ideals in the show, but then if we look at that narratively, he's also grown up in actual chaos. People only like him when he's good at pinball, so that makes him feel like it's the only part of himself that matters, and he has had to deal with everything himself and been isolated because nobody bothered to figure out how to accommodate him. And some people do genuinely feel impaired by their disabilities and don't want to feel that way anymore. Like, I used to have 25 migraine days a month. I'm a lot happier now that I only have one every other month. And I'm not going to say that it's a miracle cure and I'm free, because keeping myself to one migraine day every other month is a lot of work every single day. And also, I'm still very much a disabled person, as is he. His symptoms may be significantly better than they were when he was unresponsive, but he will probably be struggling with that for the rest of his life. And this I'm free aspect of it is a gross oversimplification. But frankly, would I say the same thing about having less migraine days? Probably. And I also, like, a lot of the vibes of internalized ableism that we get from Tommy are ways that I felt about myself before I founded this community. Like, I very much see a younger, lonelier, more alienated version of myself in the way that he talks about his experience with his disability. I also kind of like how Tommy is taken advantage of because of his disabilities, because that is very much a thing that happens all the time, and I'm glad that we've portrayed it for once. Like, people assume that since you can't fight back or speak up, it's easier to get away with, which is a serious and pervasive issue. Also, the way that his family uses him as a tool for inspiration porn to get their 5 minutes of fame and make money off of him and suddenly pretend they care about him all along and never gave up so that they can gain something from him being disabled is a thing. And the way that the media capitalizes on his inspirational story of being the disabled kid who can play pinball and he becomes a celebrity because of it. And the first moment that they effectively ask him to speak for all disabled people and teach what he has to teach when he's still trying to process all of that himself and figure out what's going on. And all of this is just really, really accurate. I also liked the weirdly patronizing way his friends treat him. That feels very on brand with the disabled experience a good deal. And he does very decently portray the experience of alienation and detachment that comes from living with PTSD, especially complex PTSD. They're also very clearly, obviously condemning a lot of what they show. They're talking about the problems with false idols and creating saints out of regular people, and they try to humanize him as best they can. Like, looking at this with the same lens that I look at other pieces, I really think this story has some merit. I've genuinely grown to like it over the course of this process. I mean, sure, it has serious issues, but then again, we have other things like Richard III where there are serious issues, and so when we stage it, we try to talk about them and work with them and find some new dramaturgical depth to it, because at the end of the day, Richard III isn't going anywhere. It's a huge part of the cultural consciousness, and messy disability representation is important too. We just need to be careful with it and also make sure we are continuing to add more and better representation to the disability canon at the same time, because half the problems of representation are just the fact that the entire canon is one-dimensional stereotype, and we have very little that branches out beyond that. As a historian, I think the idea of just throwing things in the garbage and going, well, the media is an issue, let's never look at it or think about it again, especially when these things are still so prevalent and popular, is a bit unrealistic and honestly probably an idea that scares me, because learning where media tropes come from and the effects that they have had on what came after it is really important, especially when it comes to minority representation. Like, a lot of the major issues with accessibility and disability representation in the theater world can be directly tied to the all-consuming desire to pretend that freak shows never existed, which has actually caused way more harm than good. Breaking these things down and looking at them and trying to defend them a little bit and just being, you know, reveling in the complexity of it all is a really important thought exercise that I think we should be paying attention to and doing more of. And I'm not saying that we should stage actively harmful things super frequently, more that like entirely shutting it out and pretending it doesn't exist altogether is not a great idea, because history is soup, humans are gonna human, and we need to pay attention to hard things in order to learn from them. And with a piece like this, I'm really intrigued by the messiness because it leads to tough conversations and more in-depth understandings of complicated issues. And because safe and clean representation is clinical and boring and bad storytelling and nobody wants to watch that, you're gonna fall into trope and stereotype no matter what you do. So why not figure out what the goal is and then go forth with that knowledge to figure out what you want to do with it? How can you create something that is authentic and multidimensional and messy rather than replacing a one-dimensional stereotype with a different two-dimensional stereotype? However, and this is where I go from like, okay, it's kind of redeemable and I kind of want to play with it and see what happens because it's really interesting, even though the disability community might burn me at the stake for saying that. Back to genuine concern about the show. I am looking at this from a scholarly lens. I am a trained media analyst. I'm giving this piece the benefit of the doubt because they said that what they do in the show is to condemn, not condone, and I've taken that to cover a wide swath of things, some of which they may actually have meant to condone. I have no idea. I, as a disabled media scholar, am not the primary audience for this piece. I think playing with the show in an all-disabled setting, in an all-scholar setting, would be really fun, but that's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at a show that is on Broadway right now for general audiences, many of whom, let's be real, are already so much of a fan of the music that the things that are meant to exist in it to make people uncomfortable and ruffle feathers are no longer off-putting to those audience members, meaning they are more likely to take them as face value and see them as condoning rather than condemning, which is where the metaphors and the tropes that are less obviously an issue start to become a serious concern. And again, I would like to think that we don't have to spoon-feed media literacy to people, but I also think that we've all seen the state of the universe lately, so maybe we should start doing that. Like, I'm seeing this as a period piece. Are they seeing it as a period piece? Or are they just feeling like they're 18 again in the 70s and this is their current reality, so it goes unquestioned? I'm seeing, wow, Tommy's holding a lot of internalized ableism. He really needs to unlearn that shame and self-hatred. I've been there, buddy. And the audience might be seeing that as, wow, disabled people hate being disabled and are miserable living life that way and they want to be cured. I think specifically this is going to continue the, oh, disabilities hold inherent meaning and all disabled people want cures mindset. I also think the fundamental inaccessibility of this piece about a disabled person is going to cause real harm in regards to access on Broadway, because we're kind of at a point in society where people just assume that if a minority identity is centered, there's significant attention being paid to that minority in the crew and cast, and nobody really checks to see if dramaturgs are hired in a playbill. Most people don't know what a dramaturg is, so that is also a concern. But that brings us to the trap of nostalgia. There's a general desire to keep this piece as it is. People feel a strong kinship to the source material, and so they don't want it changed. Especially the lyrics, especially the plot. They want to see the Tommy that they know, and so any attempt to change the story to be more ethical will likely be met with anger rather than a willingness to listen to the new story being told or acknowledge that maybe the original did cause harm. Small changes such as the name of the Acid Queen would be met by momentary outrage, but they consume the song more or less the same, so that one is totally doable. But a full shift in regards to the disabled storytelling would probably not go over very well, and I doubt the audience would actually listen to those changes if they did, if they were made, if that makes any sense. Obviously a portion of them would, and the people who hadn't seen it before wouldn't know any different, but that would again involve marketing it as updated to prepare people beforehand. Which, That is what they did this time though. And then they didn't actually make changes when they very well could have done so, which ends up making it look more like they're reaffirming the outdated disabled plotline as appropriate for 2024, which then causes even further harm. And for active proof of that happening, people in the comments of reviews that were less positive toward the show were calling the reviewer deaf, dumb, and blind as an insult in several different reviews that I read. So that is a thing that's actively happening. And I also, this is super tangential, but in regards to the impact of Tommy on disability representation in media more generally and in theater specifically, I don't know if you remember my deep dive into the mess that is Ricky Potts from Ride the Cyclone from last year, but I realized in writing this that he as a character is just Walmart brand Tommy. Like, Ricky is disabled in life, he uses crutches and he's non-speaking and he has no accommodations for that, and then in death he doesn't need his crutches and he's able to speak, and his song is a rock song called Space Age Bachelor Man that is reminiscent of the 60s and 70s psychedelic sci-fi, with the idea that because he didn't speak for so long he developed an overly rich inner world that he's now getting to share through rock music, who otherwise, this character does not have a personality and just kind of stands there, but when he does speak, he's saintly and good and everybody looks up to him. And then when some ableism happens in regard to a disabled actor in the role, they suddenly changed it in the script to being mutism caused by severe trauma, which to me really looks like they took Tommy, changed it to use crutches so it wasn't precisely Tommy so nobody would notice, and then got backlash for ableism with the character, so their solution was to make it closer to Tommy. And this is a musical that was first written in 2008. So that is a thing. But in regards to trying to fix Tommy, one option that has been done both in the US and the UK is to make Tommy genuinely deaf using simulcasting, where the character has a deaf actor who signs and a hearing actor who voices. The US production was at Open Circle Theatre in DC in the fall of 2016, and the UK production was done by Ramps on the Moon and New Wolsey Theatre from March to July of 2017. Overall, the reviews from both productions talked about how this restaging works really well for the first act, and then completely falls apart dramaturgically in Act 2, which makes sense because the idea is that he's cured, but then the actor is still deaf, which leads to my interpretation earlier of it actually being their acceptance that no cure is possible that makes him enlightened and free, but it seems like staging-wise that was not super clear in either iteration. But I think this is interesting because it does point to a wider issue I've noticed in the post-Deaf West Spring Awakening theater realm, where we've had a tendency to take shows with disability or that are disability-related and restage them as deaf with simulcasting to try to fix the dramaturgical issues of disability, which sometimes leads to the accidental erasure of the disability that already exists in the piece and leads people outside of the community to go, hey, they did a deaf one, so they fixed the problem, when disabilities are not inherently interchangeable, which is interesting and it's complicated, and I've been talking to a friend about this a lot recently, because culturally we use autistic coding or memory loss in media to denote alienation and separation, but then those stories of alienation also very much lean into the deaf experience of literally not being able to hear what's going on, and at what point is it erasure to restage a mentally disabled coded character as a deaf one instead? And I still don't quite know the answer to that. I think I'm leaning more towards like, it requires a scholarly textual analysis because sometimes it's just vibes, in which case that should be on the table for everyone and that is free reign. And there's other cases where there is genuine history that implies mental disability, and in that case we should probably primarily focus on authentically casting that. But again, that is also complicated because it very much encompasses the difference between an in-community acknowledgement that several different options of the same character can exist, that from the outside is often perceived as, oh cool, they did it, we don't have to think about it anymore, we're done, which is a whole other separate issue. And the fact that the popularity of deaf theater over other kinds of disabled theater directly links to the fact that Spring Awakening proved it was financially viable, and because people are more comfortable seeing ASL included in theater than they are looking at otherwise disabled people on stage because of the history of freak shows that we pretend doesn't exist, that's a whole other issue. And also, at what point are we siloing it too much and can just do both a deaf and mentally disabled version at the same time? But anyway, I do think in this case, given Tommy's narrative trajectory, casting him as authentically mentally disabled in some capacity and playing with that as part of his story is the only way for this to dramaturgically make sense. A lot of Tommy's physicality throughout the show is caricaturing stimming bodies, which feels deeply uncomfortable when you know the actors are not openly disabled. And there's also a known phenomenon where putting an authentically disabled person in a role, like 50% of the problems just suddenly magically disappear because it becomes inhabited with more care and dimension and knowledge than somebody without that lived experience would ever be able to put into that role. And of course, there already is some precedent in the sense that there already exists another very famous theatrical piece about a mentally disabled teenage boy who gets carried around the stage with far too much strobe lighting and loud sound design for its own good. So I think a mentally disabled Tommy would really fit right in. And this is where I would say, hey, I'd be down if anybody wants to try. But the other issue with the show is that I don't think a rock musical with fully accessible lighting design and quiet sound design would be very liked, so maybe it's just not worth it as a concept. But there are probably some super talented mentally disabled people who don't mind strobes and really loud music, and I bet would love to be involved, and you should cast them. But all of this brings us back to this revival. When it comes to theater, the question should always be, why here, why now? And I think for this show, what it has to say about creating false idols of people we barely know, and then the moment they're not living up to the image we have created for them in our heads, we tear them down, is very poignant to our current reality and our current political climate. It also has lots of powerful things to say about exploitation and usage of people and hypocrisy and social movements. And it does all of that really well. So I understand why here, why now. I genuinely do. But I also think that the creative team said they wanted to reimagine this for a new generation. All the articles interviewing the team talk about how it's been reimagined, but then nobody ever explains what is reimagined about it. And based on what I saw the other day, it didn't really change anything. Like, there are small pieces where they added things in to clarify, but otherwise they didn't really change anything. And that's fine, right? Like, they could have kept it exactly as is and could have said, we're just keeping it exactly as is as a memorial to 30 years ago. And I would be less frustrated with it. It's the fact that by saying they're reworking it for a modern audience, they're implying that they are going to interrogate what works and what doesn't work in the piece from a modern lens and then actually change things. And that what doesn't get changed didn't get changed because it's important and not super harmful. Reworking usually means taking out racial slurs. It means cutting a song that causes harm and isn't super necessary to the plot. That's what that language is supposed to mean. And effectively, all that happened here was removing a dramaturgically important song and some dramaturgically important lyrics and deliberately refusing to make a show centering around a disabled person remotely accessible to disabled people. And I would love to say that I'm surprised. Unfortunately, I'm not. This is what our industry looks like. And I say all of this because I love it and I want us to be able to do better because I know we're capable of doing better. And I know that a lot of doing better would just be solved by hiring more dramaturgs on things because it's consistently the issue I run into every single time that I make these. It's literally just a gap in knowledge that causes active real world harm that could be made so much better by just having a scholar in the room. But to end this on a lighter note, I also want to say how appreciative I am about all the people who've expressed concern and frustration over the show within the theater community outside of disability circles. There have been significant discussion about it during and since the Goodman production, which has brought me a lot of joy. I'm glad to know that people are thinking more critically about these things and questioning these things and then going to our community to ask for more information. That makes me really hopeful because this conversation didn't happen last year about Kimberly Akimbo when it also should have. And maybe I'm just more ingrained in the industry now than I was, so it feels like there's a change when there actually isn't. But I'm gonna stick with being hopeful about it because I think that's nice. But yeah, I hope that you learned something today, or at least that this got you thinking about stuff. I know it definitely brought up a lot of questions and philosophical dilemmas for me that were really interesting to work through, and I will definitely continue to mull that over for the next few weeks. But yeah, please be kind in the comments. I know a lot of hurt surrounds the show and this album in either direction. I would love this corner of the internet to not turn into a defensive screaming match like every other discussion of Tommy tends to become online. And also, as always with my dramaturgy videos, only about 75% of what I researched ended up in here. So if you have more questions, feel free to drop them in the comments and I will respond when I can. And the next disability dramaturgy deep dive will be Hunchback, which is already in progress because it's a long book. But in the meantime, as always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over. Remember that critical thinking is sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.